So in your first slide, just have a picture. These are fennec foxes. They're pretty cute. They live in northern Africa, typically in like desert ecosystems. When you look at these foxes, what do you notice? Like, what's the first thing, obviously, that's sort of...
They look like cats.
Yeah, why do they look like cats?
They're small.
They're small. What's their most distinguishable feature?
Ears.
Yeah, those ears. So the question is why? Why do their ears look like that? And when we start thinking about evolution and natural selection, basically we can look at any species. And if we look at their features, we can ask the question, well, how is that helpful? How is that an advantage? Because that's how evolution works. Natural selection works by allowing individuals that have certain traits or characteristics that are helpful to survive better and to reproduce more and pass on those traits. So if we think in that context about these fennec foxes, what do you think about their ears? What are some possible hypotheses you might have for why they look like that? Anyone have an idea?
So they can hear better.
That would like sort of be obvious, right? So they can hear better. How would that be an advantage? Maybe it's to hear a predator coming. They're small mammals, so they're probably good prey for larger carnivores. That's a good idea. There's another important function of those ears. These live in the desert. Can you think what else that those kind of ears would be helpful for in the desert?
Just like to provide shade.
You're getting close. It's not so much to like shade the animal.
The sand.
No, that's a good idea too, though.
Cool it off.
Yeah, they're for cooling. That as their body temperature rises, these fennec foxes can pump more blood out to the blood vessels in their ears to dissipate heat. And they give off that heat, and therefore it keeps them a little bit cooler. Okay? So we could think about any characteristic of any organism in these terms. How is an advantage? What does it do to help this animal survive? Now, let me ask you another question. So if big ears like that help these fennec foxes survive by cooling off, why aren't their ears like double that size? Okay, they could be too big. And if they're too big, what might happen?
They're like more obvious to a predator.
Yeah, maybe then they would stand out more and be easier for predators to find. So if any fennec foxes happen to be born with really big ears, they may get eaten sooner. And so what we see is the process of natural selection is sort of allow these fennec foxes to settle on this size. Okay, so let's talk about evolution. So first off, evolution as a term, as a definition, means that over a period of time, species can change. That's what evolution is. This idea that over time, species can change. But I'll come back, don't worry. Can this fennec fox, this specific one, can its ear size change once it's fully grown? No. And that's important to keep in mind. In evolution, sometimes people get confused. An individual organism doesn't evolve, doesn't adapt. It's basically born with one set of characteristics, and those are the characteristics it'll always have. A single individual does not evolve. It's a group, a species, a population that changes over time. So individuals do not evolve. Individuals don't adapt. But a group of individuals can adapt to changing conditions. This is an important term here, theory. Because in science, we use that term different than you probably use it in your everyday language. What does a theory in everyday English mean? What is a theory? Yeah, like an explanation. What are you going to say, Gabe?
An idea that's not fully true.
Or that we don't know if it's true yet, right? If I have a theory about who's going to win the Bills game next weekend, right? I have my idea based on some things. What's that?
Kind of like a guess.
Kind of. That's how we use it in everyday language. But here's why I'm telling you this. We use it very differently in science. Like in science, we have the theory of gravity, that objects are attracted to each other. Okay. Does that mean we just kind of are guessing and we're not sure if there actually is a theory of gravity? No. In science, when we use the word theory, we use it for something that's been well established through lots of observations, through many experiments. It's kind of the ultimate height of a scientific idea is for it to reach a theory. And evolution is a theory. It's well established that species change over time. And it's been tested repeatedly. It's been confirmed. It's been observed. So theory means something different in science. So that's important to remember. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail here, and you don't actually have most of these slides, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about. People have said throughout recorded history, people have thought about evolution. The idea that species change didn't start with Darwin. All the way back thousands of years before Darwin, in ancient Greece, people had this idea that species change, okay, and develop from previous species. So that's not a new idea. In China, the Taoist religion stated that species are not fixed. They're not constant. They can change. In ancient Rome, scientists described the earth as changing by natural processes, not by supernatural processes. In the Middle Ages, right, from 50 to 1,000 or so, most Christians in the world at that time believed in that idea we just learned about of special creation. They believed God created all of the species a certain way, and they would stay like that forever. That God would not create imperfect species. But even at the same time that most Christians believe that, Islamic believers wrote about concepts related to evolution, about changing species. So this varied throughout the world, throughout cultures. When we get to the Renaissance and Enlightenment, again, most of the Western world believed in special creation, and they believed the earth was only about 6,000 years old. But then, as science became more well accepted, ideas started to change. Geologists started to say, this doesn't really make sense that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And they started to push back the age of the earth to millions and billions of years. Okay, fossils were being found of species that were no longer around, species that were extinct. Okay, and so people started to ask the question: well, these species, we see this, we find a fossil of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but they don't exist anymore on Earth. Well, what happened there? Why Why are there these fossils, but we don't see those today? So that led people to start to question ideas they had about special creation. At the same time, people were studying population growth. And those works were influential to Darwin. And so Darwin, as you learned, made this trip around the earth. This is the map that shows where he went. It was a long trip. It lasted for years. Came from England, down around the coast of South America, up across to the Galapagos, over to Australia, up around Horn of Africa, back to South America, back to England eventually. So on this huge journey, Darwin was constantly collecting fossils, observing rocks, collecting animals and plants and so forth. And seeing all this is what prompted Darwin to come up with his ideas about where did these species come from. He traveled all around the world, saw a huge diversity of living things, and asked himself, well, how did this all come about? And started to put his ideas into a book called The Origin of the Species. It was published in 1859. And in this book is where he detailed his theory called natural selection. And the idea of natural selection, it's how the species evolved. Remember, people have been saying species can change for thousands of years. But Darwin came up with a model for how that happens. How do species change? And he called it natural selection. And it's what we're going to focus most of our time on. Oh, you needed me to go back on this quick. Sorry. All right. So how do we know this? How do we know species have evolved, that they've changed over time? We actually have lots of different types of evidence. And one of the first types of evidence that scientists had was the fossil record. What is a fossil? Make your earth science teachers proud. I'm not making them proud. I'm going to see them later. I'm going to see Mr. Hibman, Mr. Span, and Mr. Cleveland later. Hopefully I can give them some good news. I'll put your name with it. What is a fossil? Who can I give credit to? They're not going to be too happy. Don't make me tell them none of my students know what a fossil is. Ava?
Isn't it like slate?
It can be found in different types of sedimentary rock. I'll say that.
It's like the bones of really old animals that's been underground for a really long time.
And is it still actual bone? It's in the shape of the bone, but what is it replaced with?
Is it like oil or something?
No. It's replaced with minerals that make it like a rock, but in the shape of the former bone that was buried and compressed under it.
So like it imprints on the rock?
It can be an imprint, like some of these, like those dinosaur footprints in the lower left. Those are imprints. At some point in the past, a dinosaur walked across some mud. That's what that lower left-hand picture is. And then it got covered up with sediment and eventually got compressed to form rock. And the impression of those dinosaur prints are still there. Or it can be like this trilobite, the top left, where it's like an actual, looks like the actual living thing because its living material was replaced with these minerals. Or Archaeopteryx, like we see there. All right. And who was your science teacher? All right, I'll tell him this afternoon.
Tell them you're represented well.
All right. So scientists have been finding fossils for thousands of years. People have been finding fossils. And what we learned from those fossils is, first of all, most fossils that we find, the species no longer exists. 99% of all the species that have ever lived on Earth are actually extinct. And so lots of the fossils that are found are of extinct species. We could also use radioactive dating. I'm sure you studied that in our science too, to figure out exactly how old different types of rock is. When we do that, what we find is actually the Earth is billions of years old, 4.6 to be exact. This is way beyond what people thought of it being 5,000 or 6,000 years old. And also what we find is sometimes we can find what are called transitional fossils. These are fossils that sort of show the steps from the organism looking one way to another way. For example, this is Archaeopteryx, a very famous fossil. It's found in Germany. And it's a transitional fossil. It has some features like a reptile and other features like what? Like a bird. It has feathers like a bird, but it has a bony tail like a reptile. It has a sort of beak-like shape to its skull, but it's got teeth, more like a reptile than a bird. This shows us kind of the in-between stages. It gives us clues as to what happened to some types of reptiles that evolved into birds and how did that happen. Here's horses. Several million years ago, horses were dog-like creatures. They were small. They had toes. And over time, scientists have found fossils that show us the steps along the way that changed these small mammals that are the ancestors of horses into what we know are horses today. Their toes were modified, their jaw was modified, their size increased over time. And so we have those steps. And that is evidence that horses haven't always looked like they look like today. We have the steps showing us what they may have been like 7 or 8 million years ago. So fossils are one type of evidence we have that species have evolved. We can also look at sort of the structures, the features of organisms to give us ideas about how species have evolved. So by looking at the anatomy of species, that gives us some clues as to how species might be related to each other. We call these structures that are sort of similar, homologous structures. For example, up here on the screen you have the bones that you would find in a human arm, a whale flipper, and a bat's wing. So what do you notice about them? Are they similar in some ways? Yeah, they all have one upper arm bone, a humerus. Okay? They have lower arm bones, 2 in the human, 2 in the whale, and just 1 in the bat. Then they have wrist bones, many small bones, and finger bones. So basically, when you look inside, they're all very similar. Even though when you look at it from the outside, like a bat's wing looks very different than a whale flipper, which looks very different from a human arm. Why might they all have similar bones inside? What would be an explanation for that?
They all have evolved from one species.
Yeah, and there's a term we use for that. You're right. And it's a phrase you're going to hear many times. They evolved from a common ancestor. That's the term we use, a common ancestor. Humans, whales, and bats are all mammals. All mammals, if you go back in evolutionary history, evolved from one common ancestor. And so therefore, the bones are similar because they have that common ancestor. Just maybe your facial features are similar to your cousin. You may look alike because you have a common ancestor. Oops, not what I wanted to do. Another example of the structure